very few people could claim they've never done an act of loving kindness in their life. But people who are pretty lax in these three areas, their relationship is dead. No, it isn't. There's a concept called teshuvah, which is the concept of repairing relationships, because we can reach a part of ourselves that transcends our mind and our heart and our actions, and it links us to a part of God, if you can use the term part in relation to God, that transcends his conscious relationship with us. In other words, there's God's mind, his understanding, his feelings, and God's actions in this world. And then there's the God that transcends those. As you would see in a relationship between a parent and a child. How many times do the children irritate their parents? It happens quite often, if you live in a normal family. And you get upset, and there's a strain in your relationship. But the second your child says, I'm sorry, makes amends, the love for the child is even stronger than it was before. It develops an even deeper relationship. The love was always there. If the love is not there, then we have a real serious problem, and you need to go see a therapist. Because the parent who does not love a child, it's not a healthy thing. But we're talking about in a healthy situation, where the parent gets upset, the child did something really horrible. The love is always there, but on the surface, the parent is indignant and really creates a tremendous, terrible rift. Once the child makes amends, the bond becomes even deeper, because the child unleashed a part of his or her relationship with the parent that is deeper than these three conscious areas that are represented by the actions, the emotions, and the mind. That you reach a part of your soul that could repair all the breaches. And because you're touching a part of God that transcends his system, so to speak. So you think you can't get any better than that. There's nothing deeper than that. There's another level that's even deeper than that. And that's sometimes expressed in three different ways. Simple faith. The Baal Shem Tov, founder of the Hasidic movement, was very fond of simple people. He would often say that the simple, sincere life of a person, simple, sincere Jew, he would say, is superior to many of the great scholars who thought of themselves as being the top, the elite. He felt that sincerity of a simple person is someone whose essence is revealed. It's not clouded by their sophistication, because they have no sophistication. And no one is telling people to be simple and to be ignorant, because that's not considered to be sincere. If someone says, I'm going to work to be as ignorant as I possibly can. You know, the person who said, it says somewhere that if you stop studying for one day, it says, the greatest level of knowledge is not to know. So the person says, you know what, I know too much. And he stopped studying for a few weeks, and he discovered he knew less than he knew before. He said, I'm making progress. So he stopped studying for another year, and he knew nothing. He says, now I'm perfect. I know nothing. That's not a virtue. The virtue was the person who's naturally sincere and simple because of circumstances that they didn't have any control over. Those people are able to accomplish more than people on a much higher level. And there are many stories told of the Baal Shem Tov. There's a famous story in Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. The Baal Shem Tov was leading services, and the Baal Shem Tov was desperate. You could see his cries coming out of him during the prayer indicated that he wasn't reaching the heavens, that somehow his prayers were being obstructed. And his disciples, who were also very holy people, sensed it, and they put more effort into their prayers, and nothing was happening. Nothing was changing the atmosphere. And then all of a sudden, a peasant boy who lived in a farm miles away had come to the synagogue during the prayers, near the end actually, and he was illiterate. He had never learned how to read. He He didn't know any of the prayers. But one thing he did know, he knew how to mimic the sounds of farm animals. So in the middle of the synagogue, hundreds of people are huddled together, crying their hearts out, pleading with God to give them a good year. And he shouts at the top of his lungs, "Cockle-doodle-doo, God have pity." And they wanted to throw him out. The irreverence, the chutzpah, the sacrilege, shouting, it sounded really like a chicken. It was very good imitation. They wanted to throw him out. At that moment, the Baal Shem Tov's face changed entirely, and he was beaming with such joy, and he completed the prayers with joyous melodies. Of course, he made sure that they didn't throw him out. And later on, he explained that he could not penetrate the gates of heaven. This year was going to be a horrible year for the Jewish people, and nothing that he did was able to break through until that simple, illiterate peasant cried out from the depths of his heart, from this very essence, that broke through all the barriers and all the prayers went through. It's one of many, many stories that are told, especially about the Baal Shem Tov, who would look for the simplicity of Jewish people. And he encouraged us not to be illiterate and ignorant, but to sometimes try to go beyond and within the layers of sophistication to find that simple core of our soul that is innocent and pure and has not been corrupted. And that could break through every single barrier. That's a level of relationship that most of us can't have because unfortunately we're not so simple and we're not so sincere. That's a very, very high level. It does express itself, and this is what I referred to before, with people who gave their lives with virtually no training for it. It's not something you could train for. You could train for it. They do train people to say if you blow yourself up and take many people with you, you're going to go to heaven and so on and so forth. That's training people to be crazy. But for a person to willingly offer his or her life for something that they really never thought they would care for, that is because their very core was touched. And that core connects them to God's core, God's essence, as it were. And that's what, when we talk about redemption, the ultimate redemption, we're not just talking about freedom, which is great, that the world should be a free world, a world that will be a good world. That's all wonderful. That's all what we pray for. Redemption means that the core of our soul should no longer be encumbered, distracted by all the other levels. The relationship will be so basic and solid that nothing could rip it apart. When you get to that essence, you have made. And Yom Kippur, interestingly, is the only day of the Jewish calendar in which there are 5 formal prayers. Weekdays we have 3, holidays we have 4, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, we have 5. Why 5 prayers? It's said to correspond to these 5 levels, the 5 levels of our soul, of our personality. And the last prayer is supposed to be one in which, fleetingly perhaps, it could go away the next day, we develop this core relationship with God, at which time we are inseparable from Him. And that's the climax of Yom Kippur. But then there are crises in relationships with God as with all other relationships. One we mentioned before, how can you love and have a relationship with an abstraction? I want you to love geometry. You could love the study of geometry, but you can't love geometry. Geometry is a concept. I want you to love gravity. You can love the effects of gravity. I don't like weightlessness, maybe. Maybe I like gravity better than to be weightless. But you can't love the concept of the theory of, they don't understand gravity, but if they ever develop a theory of gravity, what causes it, what's behind it, you can't love the theory. You can love the wisdom of the theory, but you can't love a concept. It's an abstraction. How do you love God, who's an abstraction to us? That's one of the problems with a relationship with God. That's why you need the meditation. That's why you need the 5 levels, at least the first 3 levels that we have to work on, developing this relationship physically, emotionally, and intellectually. The second challenge to our relationship with God, for which we need a lot of counseling, is the pain and suffering that we endure and that exists in the world, the evil that exists. And this is the most difficult challenge that we find people posing in recent times, certainly after the Holocaust, as if suffering and pain didn't exist before the Holocaust. It's just that living in a secular world where God is constantly being challenged, the Holocaust made that challenge so much more relevant to many people. But the question was always around, why is there a world of suffering if God is so good and he wants us to love him, and yet he puts us through this suffering? When Moses comes to the burning bush, Moses is afraid to approach. He covers his face. There are many, many interpretations of that, and I'm not going to go through them. I just want to share one little insight. God was confronting Moses. He's trying to get Moses to become the liberator. And you can imagine that Moses was the best person for the job because he cared the most. What was the first act that Moses did that we know of in the Torah? I don't know what he did in the movie, but I know it says in the book. Yes.
He killed a person who was harming another person, and it probably was an Egyptian.
He killed an Egyptian taskmaster who was mercilessly beating a Jew, a Jewish slave, and he was so indignant that he killed the taskmaster. His first public act was an act of love, even though he killed someone, but he couldn't tolerate the injustice of someone not only enslaving another person, but brutally torturing them. And that was what defined Moses' whole existence. Moses was not a violent person. Moses was a loving person, and he was the ultimate leader of all of Jewish history. He is considered to be the ultimate leader. And the way he was tested at the burning bush, the Midrash tells this very beautiful story of how Moses was tending the sheep of his father-in-law, and one of the lambs, a little lamb, just got lost somewhere, and he was searching far and wide until he found the lamb and picked it up, caressed it, and took care of its needs. And God says, you're the right leader. You care for every little member of your flock. You're not going to say, well, I have so many people in my community, you can dispense with one. I can't take care of everyone. He cared for everyone. The most insignificant of the people was someone Moses cared for with all of his love and devotion. God says, you can be the leader of my people. So Moses here is the loving, caring leader for whom every individual counts and is important. He feels the pain of all of his brethren. And what's going on here? God is telling him, I'm now going to send you to liberate the Jewish people. Moses could probably have a lot of arguments with God. Why have you subjected them to such suffering and such pain? So God was willing to tell Moses the reason, to explain everything to him. God is saying, Moses, you want to know why this happened? I'm going to give you a lecture. I'm going to explain it to you. And Moses covers his face and says, no, I don't want to hear. I don't want to know why suffering and pain is good. I don't want to understand it. Because if I do understand it, I will not feel the pain and suffering of the people who are suffering. I don't want to alleviate my pain. I want to share my pain with those who are suffering. And God, in a sense, says the same thing to Moses. Later on, God says to Moses says to God, what am I going to tell the people? Well, ask me, God, who is he? What's his name? And God says, tell them that I will be who I will be, or I am who I am. There are different translations. The more accurate one is, I will be who I will be. What kind of answer is that? That's a name? And what's the point of asking? Why would they ask the name of God? Does it make a difference what name he has? And this is the mystical way of explaining it. Moses knew that the people are going to say, oh, all of a sudden God wakes up. You know, for hundreds of years he lets us suffer here in slavery. Oh, now he's going to be the merciful, compassionate liberator. He's going to take us out of our misery. He finally realized that we're suffering. What kind of a God is that? What's his name? What defines God? Is God a God who doesn't know what's going on, and then he wakes, somehow he got a message, a delayed message that his people are suffering for hundreds of years? So God says, Moses, I can't explain to you. You don't want to hear the reasons why they're suffering. But I want to tell you, I am with them in their suffering. I share in their suffering. I have never looked from a faraway perch down at them and ignored them. I suffer with them. There's a Hebrew expression, a biblical expression, Imo anochi b'tzaretz, from the book of Psalms. I am with them in distress. However, we don't understand God's ways. We don't know the answer. Moses didn't want to hear the answer. But don't think for a moment that I am not part of that suffering. I am suffering with them. And now I am taking them out of that misery. That's what you should tell them. Tell them that I'm not a God who is too aloof and too distant. And all of a sudden I'm willing to come down. I was with them all this time. So we don't have a reason. And we don't want to know the reason. How many people would walk into a room and if I'd say to you, you want to know why the Holocaust happened? And if I'd say, you mean if I give you an explanation, you're prepared to accept an explanation that would justify it? You'd be out of your mind to say that. So when we ask the question, why does this happen? We are also saying, I'm not accepting an answer. I have a question, I'm not accepting any answer, because there is no answer that we can give. You know why there's no answer? Because every answer we can give as to why there's pain and suffering, and we can find some rationalization for it. For example, a person would say, oh, suffering is a test. God wants to test our faith. That's a valid point. It's true. God does give us tests. We give other people tests. We test ourselves. God does the same thing. But that's not a good answer. Why isn't that a good answer? Because why do you need tests? Because that makes you better. Who created the system that testing makes you better? God created that system. So the question still persists. Why did God have to create a system that requires suffering and pain to be able to grow? Yes, suffering and pain helps us grow. There's no question about it. Yes?
Yeah, I never saw a problem with, focusing on, whether it's the Holocaust or why the Romans were able to dominate and say, why was that what happened? I think underlying those instances is a more basic theological problem, perhaps, that there seems to be this strain running through the world of might making right, which seems a direct contradiction to the essence of what Judaism is, that acts of loving kindness and discipline are what the world, will ultimately should be run on, versus, again, the crass might makes right that seems to be dominating. And in fact, in the ancient days, the Jews weren't a problem because we're just going to attack them on the Sabbath. And it wasn't until they decided, we're not going to allow ourselves to be trampled on the Sabbath.
I don't understand the connection to what we're discussing.
Well, the connection is the doubt. It's not so much the pain and suffering, but the underlying tone that, the contradiction of might making right over what's, being taught in Torah is really the problem.
We're talking about God, not about the people who are the perpetrators of the atrocities. Why does God allow pain and suffering in this world? The pain and suffering that comes from people. God gives us free choice, but that doesn't answer the question. God gives us the ability to choose to do horrible things. There are certain choices that we don't have. I can't fly to the moon right now. I don't have that choice. But certain things, God gave me that choice. Why did he give me a choice to be able to harm someone else? God should have made it impossible that as soon as my fist is ready to touch flesh, it should stop. There'd be a physical impossibility for me to harm someone. I don't have that physical impossibility. Why? Why did God allow that? Then there are God-initiated catastrophes that God causes and innocent people die. That's the question that Moses has been asking, the question that Jeremiah and Job and everyone from the beginning of time. So and we'll never stop asking this question until the Messianic age. Then it says God will somehow, in God's infinite power, reveal to us the suffering and pain only after it will be abolished. Not before, not a second before. As long as there's still suffering and pain in this world, he doesn't want us to really understand it. Because if we understand it and we become comfortable with it, that itself takes away our ability to be fully human and to fight against and militate against the suffering and pain. Yes?
I was just going to ask, it seems like a form of massive denial, cop-out, not to accept that we can't and shouldn't understand God's reasoning or his motives. It seems like we're just kind of walking away from it, even here on earth, not in the future or
You want to have an explanation? Is that what you're saying? Would you prefer having a good explanation for all suffering and pain?
yes.
Out of intellectual curiosity? Or because you would feel more comfortable with God?
Also feeling more understanding and closer to God. So partly intellectual, partly sense of closeness.
Okay, that's a very good point. That, okay, God has a reason why he doesn't want us to understand, but isn't he hurting himself that way? Because if he would let us understand, we would have no problem loving him. It would be so much easier if all we could think about when we think about God is all the beautiful things that happen in life and negative things that wouldn't exist. But that wouldn't be the ultimate love. The love, there's a story told, I don't know if it's a true story, but it's certainly a true story in terms of how people reacted to suffering and pain in the past. Many people, not all, obviously, but the story is told that a Jew during the Inquisition was driven out of the land, and then he lost his family members one after the other, and then he himself was reduced to almost nothing. And after every blow he got, he said, God, I know you're trying to get me to hate you. Nothing you will do to me will take my love away from you. Well, that's the story of Job. That's the story of many, many great and holy people who were able to see through the pain and suffering. That doesn't give me an explanation why God causes it, because God could have given us the ability to have the love without the pain and suffering. So the answer I don't have, but all I can tell you is that that's the challenge that we've been given. The challenge we've been given is to have love, even when there's so many things that seem to put us in a position where love is very difficult. Again, take a child and a parent. What do you tell a child who says, I don't love my parents because they did this to me and that to me? Do you tell the child, well, fine, hate your parents. They deserve to be hated. Or, where it's possible, not always possible, and sometimes you can't do it, you don't try to do it, there's a way you have, as a therapist, to try to get the child to see the good in his parents, and to separate the good from the evil, and to love the parent regardless of the negative. If that's possible, wouldn't you prefer that over making the child feel at peace with his or her decision to hate his parents? Which would you prefer? I think we'd all agree that we're better off keeping the love, and then that love is a tested love. Nothing could break us away from that love. But there are challenges, and sometimes we react with anger and rebellion, and that's fine. Many Jews who went through the Holocaust, I remember this very clearly and vividly. I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s. The Holocaust was pretty fresh in the minds of the survivors. There were two groups of survivors that I grew up with. One group of survivors were religious people because my father was the rabbi, so they came to the synagogue. So they were obviously religious people who wanted to be part of Judaism. And they never spoke about their questions. I never heard them raise the question about where was God. Never heard it, not even once. Then there was another group of Jews that I met. Friday afternoons we would go to the Lower East Side, students, to go to visit Jewish stores, to help them fill in and share with them some literature. It was part of our rabbinic training. And invariably, every single store that had a Holocaust survivor, they were all bitter and angry and always questioning God. And of course, as I was a teenager, I thought I was going to give him some theological explanations for things, and it got him even angrier. And I saw two very different images emerging. But you know what? As time went on, that second image faded away. I taught a course at UB, Holocaust and Jewish Law. It was essentially about the theological understanding of the Holocaust and the problems that it posed. One of the things they had to do for a grade was to interview a Holocaust survivor about their faith and observance before, during, and after the Holocaust. So they had to analyze what level they were at before the Holocaust, during, and after. And I think I have about 200 of such papers. That was one of the options they had for a grade. And of those 200, I can only remember about 2 papers in which the person wrote, I'm angry at God, I don't believe in him, and I have nothing to do with Judaism, I'm fed up with it because of what happened. When I was younger, almost everyone I met that didn't show up in a synagogue was bitter and angry. Again, this is anecdotal, this is not scientific sampling, but that seemed to be my experience. But from these 200 papers, virtually everyone said, either I didn't lose my faith, or I lost it but I regained it. Some said, I'm not as religious as I used to be, but I'm still religious, and I want my children to grow up as Jews, and I want my grandchildren to get a Jewish education. Virtually every single one of them had a positive view of God and of Judaism, in spite of their suffering and pain, which they might have lost during the Holocaust or shortly after. This was my experience, and can be documented. Again, it's not a scientific sampling, but I think it's pretty much instructive that, yes, there's anger, and that anger is justifiable. And I know of one Holocaust survivor who would avoid coming to one of my classes. The JCC, I used to give a class, and he would walk down the hallways, and I asked someone, why doesn't he come into the class? He said, well, he's very angry, he doesn't believe in God. And I said, I don't believe that he doesn't believe in God. If he's angry, then of course he believes in God. Because if you're angry, you have to be angry at something, at someone. You can't just be angry. So one day he comes into the class, and I told him, you know what? God wants you to be angry. He wants you to protest and to say, why did this happen? That shows that you believe in him, and it shows that you're sensitive, that you're a sensitive human being. If it doesn't bother you, and you don't argue about it, then either you don't believe in God, so there's no one to argue with, or you don't care about the suffering. So your anger is actually a natural and positive thing. It's good to resolve the anger, but it's not a negative. And you know what? He never said a word that he doesn't believe in God. He kept on coming to the classes, and he was always talking about God as if it's a natural thing. The thing that made him say there is no God, if you don't like someone and you're angry at them, what's the worst thing you could tell them? You don't exist. What?
I wish you were dead.
Or you don't exist. You're not here. But telling someone you're not here is the affirmation of their existence. And you're just so upset that you're telling them what you think that would make them most disturbed. As soon as he saw that it's not a bad thing to do what he was doing, he felt comfortable. But this is one of the ways of dealing with this crisis in our relationship with God. And in the end, the crisis can strengthen it. That's a very important thing. Crisis should not be viewed as just a negative. The crisis in faith, in our relationship, is always a prelude to a deepening of that relationship, if we put the effort into it. Yes?
wasn't there also another reaction to the Holocaust for some survivors where they were afraid to be Jewish anymore? There's a book written, After Long Silence, where the daughter of survivors had this sense that there was something going on with her parents who went to church. Her mother always came back from church very angry on Sundays, and I forgot how the book went, but she discovered actually they were Jewish survivors. And then you have people like Madeleine Albright, who were shocked to find out that she was Jewish. So people were afraid. Do you want to address that?
Any reaction that anyone had to the Holocaust is understandable. And I said this many times, we have no right to judge anyone who went through that experience. What I'm doing is the opposite. I'm saying the natural reaction for these people would be not only to be angry, but to hide their Jewishness, to run away, which some people did. Some people, I know Australia has proportionately the highest percentage of Holocaust survivors, proportionately, of any place in the world except maybe Israel. Why did they go to Australia? Many of them went there because they thought that if we get to the moon, we go to the moon. But at least Australians, they were far away from the rest of Jewish civilization. They wanted to escape their Jewishness. And they were found, of course. They were brought back into the fold. That's the natural reaction. If someone says, I'm not going to be Jewish anymore, I'd say, I pity the person. It's terrible. He's a casualty of the Holocaust, but I understand it. God forbid, who are we to judge someone whose shoes we never were? We can't be in anyone else's shoes because everyone is different. So there's no way any human being has a right to judge any other human being who went through the Holocaust. But I marvel, and what I think proves a point, is that in spite of all that, look how many hundreds of thousands of survivors built lives, built Jewish communities, maintained their faith, even if they claim that they're not believers, and they expressed their anger in some form, and they didn't hide their Jewishness. How many Holocaust survivors hid their Jewishness? I don't know what the percentage is, but I believe it's a very small percentage compared to those who were more identifiably Jewish than their American counterparts. And again, I said this many times, you go to any Jewish community, you can gauge the strength of the Jewish community. It's directly correlated to the number of Holocaust survivors in that community. The more Holocaust survivors, the stronger the community. I've seen this in every community that I've ever visited. The more Holocaust survivors, the more Jewish people go to synagogue, the more children go to Jewish schools, the more philanthropy, the more of everything Jewish. Yes?
Is more than being Jewish, being God-fearing.
Did I use the word God-fearing once today?
Not God-believing.
Yeah,
I'm just pointing out that there is more to being Jewish than having to believe.
You're saying that there's a concept of a cultural Jew that has nothing to do with God.
80% supposedly of Israelis are secular.
No, that's not true. That's not true. That's absolutely, 80% are not what you call ultra-Orthodox. But 90% of Israelis or more believe in God. It's much higher than American Jews. Most Israelis are observant in one form or another, much more than any other place in the world. There's a very small percentage, I don't know what it is, of confirmed atheists or anti-religious. That's a small minority, very vocal minority. The vocal minorities give an impression that they really are, and they have the media that supports them in many of the things that they believe in, the anti-religious. But it's not really so. But you're asking, is it all right to just be a cultural Jew without God? Well, if I would believe that that's fine, then I wouldn't have what to talk about today. This course would be 5 lectures instead of 6. Obviously, we're approaching this from the perspective of Judaism, which you can't escape God. I mean, a person could say, I am a cultural Jew, but then he's rejecting 99.9% of everything that has ever been said about Judaism since the beginning. So it's another religion that has Jewish elements to it. And I'm not judging that person because I believe, and the Torah believes, that every good thing that you do counts. You don't say everything or nothing. And if a person says, I do good things, but I'm only a cultural Jew, that is fine. But it's very far from describing and defining what Judaism is and what the ideal is. And again, if we had a better understanding of our relationship with God, that would strengthen the cultural aspects of Judaism as well. And if you tell me, well, I know many people who believe in God and they're horrible people, because their belief in God is flawed as well. I can guarantee you that their understanding of God, the relationship with God is a flawed one. Sometimes we create God instead of God creating us. We create God in our own image, and we say, well, I want my God to think that it's a good thing to spit at someone. I want my God to think it's a good thing to throw stones at someone. These are perverted behaviors of a very small minority of people, but they act like they're very religious, but there's something flawed in their theology as well. But if you have a sound theology, relationship with God, it will affect, in a positive way, all the other relationships. Yes?
Sometimes when people are involved in relationships, and the relationship to God is the acceptance of pain and suffering, and the relationship to other human beings, sometimes they can accept pain and suffering as part of the natural course of healthy relationships.
That's a fact of life. Yes, you're stating a fact of life, that every relationship has some pain and suffering in it. Because whenever you put two people together, in any configuration, you're going to have tension, because we're different people. God created us to be different. We all share something, but we all have our differences. Otherwise, God would say, why do I need two of the same? It's redundant. There's no redundancy in this creation. So by nature, God, the Talmud says, just like there are no two people who look alike, even identical twins have some minor differences, there are no two people who think alike. And therefore, there's bound to be tension and friction in every relation. That's a given. That's like a fact of life. It's as true a fact of life as we breathe. The problem is that we sometimes make that fact of life we let it govern and spread and destroy the relationship instead of saying, well, this is the reality of life, I have to overcome it. Yes, just like we have hunger, so what do? We eat to overcome the hunger. We sleep to overcome tiredness. Well, friction is part of life. We have to do something to overcome that. And that's why we have counseling to help people overcome that friction. Yes.
I just wanted to sort of summarize what everybody said. A lot of evil in the world, a lot of pain and suffering. But the focus of being a Jew is to repair that. Teaching love, number one. And there is in our physical bodies, and you know this better than anybody in this room, is we all have a Yetzer Tov, a good inclination and a bad inclination. And we can't all have Yetzer Tov 100% because then we have no motivation to do that Tikkun Olam. So there's always a struggle within us. And this evil is here with us. We have to try to struggle to repair it.
Right, and if we would not feel the pain, if we would try to understand it and rationalize it, we wouldn't want to repair it. We'd say, it's good. Why should I repair it? So God wants us to, on one hand, recognize that there must be some reason that God has that we don't understand, but we are not here to embrace God's giving of pain and suffering. We're here to erase it. Erase, not embrace. Okay, thank you very much. Next week, what's the subject next week?
Our relationship with others.
What?
Conflict resolution. Conflict resolution.